Let's get close, but not so close. You can share from a distance or in time. No, we want to see each other. You'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we talk. Let's get close, but not so close. You can share from a distance or in time. No, we want to see each other. You'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we talk.
It's episode 26 of Quarantine. Hey, I'm Peter Hirschberg, and 26 means it's been about 1/4 of a year. Today, we're going to continue this path that we've been on as we reopen and we reimagine kind of how cities, how the economy, how life will be afterwards, after this kind of fluid moment of change. We're going to dig into that, and we're going to use a new framework, one that says that we might consider a future in which we think both about our places and their potential physicality. We want to think about minds and meaning. How is it that our places can accelerate how we think, our wellness, our possibilities, and science and art? And Mickey and I are spending this whole week helping to convene a conference looking at that. And we want to share with you some of that thinking today. And with me to join us from Toronto is Beth Coleman, who is one of our other key participants here. She is an artist, a smart city innovator. Hi there.
Hey, Peter.
Okay, well, why don't we just, first of all, welcome. Hello. You and I have been collaborating for a couple of months now. Maybe we should just set the framework here. Let's talk a little bit about what this Humanity Design Summit is. This attempt to bring together both the humanities and wellness and the idea of flourishing cities together with the science of cities.
Yeah, so I mean, Peter, both you and I have a certain level of obsession in terms of what's been going on with smart cities over the past, decade-ish, and also where the fails have been. So I'm in Toronto, so I have been part of the landscape firsthand. Sorry, my hands are a little hot, jazz hands. Around Sidewalk Labs. And if we put it in a nutshell, I think we could say there was a problem around trust, and some of that had to do with technological determinism, where the tech was leading the design, and it really was a good signal at the beginning of COVID in North America and COVID in this major city that we need to rethink how we are framing this and put it in better balance in terms of the civic, participatory, and things that are not just technologies. So, I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
Yes. Well, so here's what we've done. You may some of you may remember Nicole Bradford, who was been with us on a couple of episodes. We kind of took three disciplines together. We took this approach to kind of participatory cities, together with this notion that, look, we have to build for resilience, adaptability, and the fact that this is going to be such a time of change. And then we looked at this whole movement towards flourishing or wellness or happiness. On an individual level, you can program for things like mindfulness, and we can have quantified self and figure out how to make ourselves, what are the things we need to do to nourish ourselves. And we can also do things like, working out or yoga. But what does it mean for a city to do that? And if we have adaptable, programmable structures in cities, rooms that can read your mood, or even outsides that gamify and encourage us to be more active, Perhaps the thing we program our cities for may be more around flourishing or inclusive economies than what smart cities are programmed for, which tend to be efficiency or particular energy metrics and stuff like that in a more integrated way. I don't know, Omid, if we have that slide, if there's an image here that we can share, but that we could bring that thing up in a moment. So that's really what and okay, here's this little model that we've used. And Friday's show, we're also going to get into this. So today we're going to go deep into minds and meaning. And Mickey's going to give us an introduction to kind of who we're going to hear from in a moment. Beth and I tomorrow are going to be hosting the art and science component of it. And then on Friday, on our Friday show, we're going to talk about both art and science and places and potential. Beth, before we go on to today, you all may remember, who watched the show the other day, that we had Robin on from City Planning in San Francisco, and he mentioned the fact that San Francisco just opened its restaurants up for outside dining only because of COVID and because it's safer. But of course, you can't make money with the very few outside tables we have. So the mayor has signed an order which says that restaurants can apply for permits to take over sidewalks and parking spaces, and in some cases, some of the streets, so there can be more outdoor dining. The very first night of this was Friday. I went out on Saturday night, and I was completely astounded. It was like walking into Venice, Italy. I mean, everybody was out of the streets. I was a little jarred because, honestly, I hadn't seen more than one or two people, and they were just bundled up with masks on for like 4 months, and all of a sudden, street life. And so I caught up with a friend who runs a restaurant in North Beach, and he gave me a sense for what was going on there. So let's go back to Saturday night as San Francisco opens up. San Francisco reopens. A special report. Hey, this is Peter Hirschberg. I'm in North Beach, and this is the second night that San Francisco has been open. And I'm with Dario Nicota at Aquilina. This is your second night open?
Oh, yes. The second, yeah, definitely, yeah.
People are very excited to be out, I think.
People are, it's a blast. So people, they really, there was a lot of, waiting for this happening, and it's going to be amazing. A lot of people happy. A lot of reservation, a lot of walk-in. It's been a really amazing day.
So the city says they want to expand eating, taking over more of the streets and more of the sidewalk. Are you going to have more outdoor eating?
Yes, definitely. I already apply and to get the parking lot. And this process takes a little longer because, they have to make sure that you're not going to put your tables in the middle of the cross. But then, I hopefully will come next week. Yeah, let's see. Yeah, so this is a common table. So people, you can see two groups together. And here is the bar. Here is the plexiglass.
Yeah.
So people can have the experience. Say, where I can sit at the bar. No, you cannot see because it's outdoor dining. It's going to be a new bar. We move the bar from inside to the windows.
It may be when this is all done that San Francisco may be more of an outdoor eating town. It may feel more like Venice than San Francisco.
This is amazing. If you see outside, there was people here, people this corner, people at the corner, people at the corner, people at the park. This is what the people want. People want humanity is not born to be alone. So, and even a man thinks about it. 20,000 years ago, he would have died against the mammoth, against the tiger with the long teeth, because our strength is community, is being together. So we got like a man. We want social life, and everybody outside, everybody have a hangout. It's why we cannot do in San Francisco. Why things are so complicated?
And there you have it. Mankind is not going to be able to fight the woolly mammoth unless you can go outside to a pizzeria and have some vino, and that's kind of what we heard from our friend there. Beth, welcome back. That was kind of exciting, right? To feel the energy of a city opening up.
Oh, it's great. And I was like, oh, saber-toothed tigers are in the mix. I love it. But This is what cities are for. This is why we're here. We love the exchange. I think your friend is quite right that, and it's also this funny moment of the walkable city. Like we're having like these Jane Jacob moments as we start to kind of open things up. Like the scale is very human. We're not seeing cars, but we also have the new kind of design of social distance. So how do you think that's going to play out in terms of physical distancing, yet being in the same places, in public at least?
The first thing is, you know, for all the talk, have you noticed we've talked about AI less recently because we've had problems that basically people have to go figure out. So one of the interesting things that he was doing at Aquilina, I don't know if you picked this up, but he had a friend who works in plexi. So he took his big communal table and just started putting plexi dividers up about every 4 people so he could have social distancing. He ripped out his wall and then turned it into a plexi pass-through so he could move the inside bar to the outside. So, you know, I think what we'll see is innovation in space in real time. Now, normally, if you innovate in space, you come up with an idea, you have a hearing, there's some architects, you get a permit, you get entitlement, and then a few years later, it happens. Well, here it's like, if it didn't work in the morning, maybe it'll work by the evening. So I think we'll see some of that. There's a club I belong to in San Francisco called The Battery, and they just opened up in 2 of their outside spaces. And so you had to make a reservation to go hang out where normally you just showed up, and it crashed the computer system. They could not handle the number of people. So there does seem to be an enthusiasm. On the other hand, look, this is all an experiment. I don't know how many people, you know, some of the infection rates are going up. But to answer your question, I think all of this talk about we're leaving cities as a temporary thing. Like every time people have left cities, they've come back. What do you think?
I don't know. I mean, maybe we're looking at, maybe this sounds retro, but cities software models where we are rapid prototyping and moving away from the idea of the architectural and the built as a kind of hardware. And I know I'm being influenced by some of the people I've been speaking with at the Audacities Summit, because they're literally trying to configure mutable and responsive spaces. But these are actually moving toward super high tech, like ML, like amplified. So it might not be front of mind because we are trying to deal with, you know, very embodied and human issues. But I don't think that the acceleration around AI has disappeared, Peter.
Well, right. And in fact, the issues brought up by AI, which we talked a lot in the show, are with us. But I do think that in the real-time response to COVID, now, of course, look, contact tracing for predicting where these things go, very useful. But in terms of waking up in the morning and figuring out where humanity will go and coming up with something brand new, it's not an AI problem. Okay, for today's show, by the way, there's so many rich things that are going on here. We had, before this even happened, right, we had the move towards both more and more technology in cities and the desire to make this much more humane, as your Toronto thing points out. We had the beginning of these adaptable structures. When we started planning this conference, you know, and we've had Poppy Crum on the show, we knew that rooms and buildings can respond to people. And we've talked about some of the work that Mickey's done at Autodesk, where you're measuring how teams are behaving and you can optimize for productivity or happiness or whatever. So all that was going on. Then this crisis comes. Let's do this. Let's turn it over to Mickey, who is going to bring us through the first phase of this conversation, which is basically we spent a century really developing the hard sciences. And as we heard from Ting on this show before, all of this stuff around human potential, around happiness, around performance, around understanding how we're thinking in our moods and improving that, we're at the very beginning of that and at the very, very beginning of applying that to cities. But that is the path that we get to talk about here. So let's throw it over to Mickey and then some of his guests today. And then Beth, you and I are going to come back at the end with Mickey to continue this. So, ladies and gentlemen, our co-host, Mickey McManus.
My digital twin has joined. Hi. Yeah. No, you know, I don't think I'm your digital twin or your virtual twin or whatever. I feel like I'm probably more like your imaginary stunt double. You kind of call me in to try wild things. And I guess it's crowded in here. inside this space. I feel like there's an awful lot of me inside here, all thinking different things, and then we all kind of come together and try to do something in the world. Thanks for inviting me. And what I thought I would do is sort of zoom in on what we're talking about over the 3 days. And today is the first day, so we're going to actually talk about minds and meaning. And in a sense, minds and meaning are sort of about, what makes us human. And in a sense, it's sort of the inner landscape of the mind. It's not the outside world, but it's our sort of inside world. And how do we get out of self-doubt, and how do we get to a point of curiosity, and I don't know, really my goal would be to, how do we help feel a sense of agency? How do we grow ourselves? And our speakers are going to talk a little bit about the intersection of minds and meaning, and science and art, and a little bit about, minds don't happen in a vacuum. We actually live in a place, and we find potential through time, over time, or we feel lonely and we feel demoralized over time. Sometimes, we get kicked down and we can't get back up. So they're going to be each talking today about sort of the intersection of these things. And tomorrow, we're going to have sessions that really look at sciences and arts. I think a lot about how science is sort of like the experimental method. It's that little beaker that we have a hypothesis, and then we turn it on and we try to figure out some way to compress all of our observations and discoveries about phenomena in the universe, and turn it into something that gives us predictability. E equals mc squared is a pretty amazing compression that Einstein came up with. 3 letters, a number, but it helped us develop atomic energy. It helped us understand space and time. And it was an incredible way for us to use science to try to predict a little bit about what the future brings. I kind of feel like the other end of that spectrum, though, if science is about the kind of compressible, art, I think of as almost, it's really, how does an artist individually explore the future? How do they look at the sort of uncompressible of human existence? It's not supposed to be about shorthand or cliff notes. In some ways, it's about expanding. It's understanding the inner mind. How do I think about you, and then how do you think about somebody else? That might be the best thing to do, would be to sort of read a book about it, a novel or something like that. And that's a scientific investigation. So is painting, so is music, so is all these things that artists are really exploring their own agenda through reacting to the world around them in the moment. And they're sort of helping us push the boundaries of what we know. They're the ones that are the explorers, that kind of go to the very edge and they keep going. And so we really want to see how we can embrace both the science side of things, the compressible, but also the uncompressible, the ineffable in some ways. And I think of places and potential as kind of, whether it's our house, whether it's our family, whether it's our street corner, or whether it's our city, or our community. Each one of those is sort of a nested containment, a recursion up and down. But it's the place that things happen. Our minds aren't in a jar. Our minds are like engaging with others. We're shaped by other people. And it also seems to happen not only space, but I think over time. We sometimes feel this sort of infinite happiness, and then we feel really demoralized sadness, like we can't get any lower. And how do we go through, over time, find a safe psychological space to kind of stretch ourselves, to almost over time kind of go through the hero's journey, go down into the dumps, the hero's journey, or it's called man or woman in a hole. We get into a hole, but ultimately friends and family and other people help us get back out again. And we're a little better for it. at the end. So how do we find that place for experimentation for ourselves of what we could be, and how do we have lifelong learning to explore that? So ultimately, our goal would be Minds and Meaning the first day, Science and Art the second day, and sort of brainstorm a little bit during the open sessions, and then really pull it together into pilots and prototypes and experiments that we can try out in place, in potential, to shift really from the old way of thinking about cities to cities that thrive and help us prepare for the unknown, the volatility and uncertainty of the future. I think that's kind of the point of a city, is to help us prepare for the unknown and be able to strive and thrive. Can we keep it moving? Yeah, I know I go on for too long. Well, let's get rolling. Okay, our first speaker is Ting Jiang. She's a behavioral scientist and a researcher at Duke's Center for Advanced Hindsight. And she'll be sharing a little bit about what she thinks is a sort of dark age of mind and meaning. And how do we get out of it? How do we enter the enlightenment era of mind and meaning? So let's join Ting now. Ting, thanks for joining us today. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and then jump on into your presentation?
Thank you for having me here. So I work at Dana Release Lab at Duke University, and our center's name is called Center for Advanced Hindsight. It's actually an actual nudge, keeping us aware of how we don't know things in foresight, and we only know it in hindsight or post-rationalized things.
I love that name. So yeah, share with us a little bit about the research you've been doing and what you've been working on. What is top of mind, and what are you excited about?
I am fascinated by how much we fail in promoting well-being.
Wow.
So if we look at the stats of mental health, depression, loneliness, stress, anxiety, stats of physical health, increasingly so many more people die and suffer from heart disease, cancer, diabetes. And during the lockdown time, I cannot help pondering about the question, are we really in a crisis of mind and meaning? And what is the problem really with our current approach that fails to make a real difference? Is it a problem of speed or actually direction? So our center's mission is to promote well-being, to help people be happier, be healthier. And what we need is not necessarily a tweak anymore. It might be a revolution in the approach. And I dare to provoke you that I believe, or I'm inviting you to answer this question with me. Are we in the dark ages of mind and meaning? So what's happening in the Middle Ages, in the Dark Ages, is that absence of science, absence of culture. And while we are championing in sciences like medical science and material science and rocket science, are we doing as well in human-related sciences? Not just in having, those disciplines and having those insights, but in applying them to our actual life, to real life. So if we look at all of these problems, they are as fatal as cancer, right? And if we look at heart diseases, in fact, we have scientific evidence proving that lifestyle, our behavior, our daily lives, decisions can be 4 times more effective in preventing those diseases and 2 times as effective as in curing than medicines available for them. And most unscientifically, we blame ourselves for not being successful in those lifestyle optimization and change. And once we realize what's wrong, what do? We make New Year resolutions about it. And after a month, a third of us already gave up.
They never work. Yeah.
But then we make the New Year resolution over and over. It's as if like taking that, Chinese herbal medicine. I mean, I've taken lots of Chinese herbal medicine in my life, but some of them really are not working, and we don't understand that we're not being scientific about it.
And we kind of blame ourselves, like we don't have enough willpower, or we should be able to do better. And we also maybe think that we're experts because we're human, we're inside of our bodies. And it turns out
intuitions. We have some partial knowledge about it. And it makes us very kind of comfortable just resting on those, understanding. especially in today's world. I mean, we're we Google about things and we feel good about those partial knowledge. We don't realize that behavioral change and human decision making can be as technical as curing cancer and bleeding. Changing our habits, what influences our behavior, really goes beyond our attitudes and intention. There's a reason that we know not to hurt ourselves by putting our hands on fire or cutting ourselves, but we keep on staying up at night, overeat, text and drive, or smoke, which kill ourselves.
Yeah.
So it's not that simple. This is quite a well-known example in behavioral science. These fascinating differences among cultures in organ donation rate. And if you first, if you look at it, you might see this maybe it's country differences. But then taking a second look, Netherlands and Belgium are very similar lowlands, right? One is having 28%, the other is 98% in organ donation. What explains the difference? Is it because one culture is more ethically minded? It turns out that the forms were designed differently. So by default, in the upper one, it's an opt-in. You check the box if you want to participate. And people don't check the box, they don't join. In the opt-out one, you check the box if you don't want to participate. If you don't check the box, you don't, you join. So the default is actually what people go with. And it drives these drastic differences. And when we ask them, why did you become an organ donor or not, nobody says, oh, it was the form and I just don't like to check boxes. And, it was the easiest thing to go with, just the status quo, that I was autopiloting. I didn't think too much about it. They would make up beautiful reasons, like, if I'm Anne, I care about saving people's lives. Or if I'm not, what if the doctors cares about saving 6 people using all of my organs instead of, really trying to save me. So this attribution to our intention and attitudes and not realizing how our environment has influenced us when we are in an autopiloting mode, and how often we are in the autopiloting mode. So really, I think the idea about choice architecture and how our external world has failed to take into account all the scientific insights that we know about human decision, and we've missed out tons of opportunities to help with our well-being, and partly the reasons why we are not making much progress, because we have been trying to put all the pressure, and people are already stressed out enough, and now thinking that we are the problems. And so I think we need to really take a drastically different approach and get more scientific about this. In fact, I want to give you one example. So this was in China. There was a new district, and we know how difficult it is for people to get enough exercise. In the US, you have barely 20% who meets the requirement of enough exercise portion in a daily life. So we created this design of this biking, this collective biking, and it's gamified, and the more people bike on it, the louder is the music, and the higher is the fountain. And this kind of architectural tweaks were nothing the architects were thinking of, but once we explain that there's a scientific backing of effectiveness, they all embrace it, and they know where to put them, right? How to make best use of them, and so that is the more scientific approach to external environmental design. Likewise, towards our internal world, we also need to upgrade our habits and our automatic responses. And so far, we are acting myopically in many occasions. We are drawn by immediate rewards instead of the long-term values that really matter to us. And in some way, we can go around it by gamify things and creating this substitution of rewards that get us to do the right behavior. But on the other hand, you do need the human intelligence to truly understand what matters to us, to know what kind of tools or external methods to interact with. You still need that sort of deep understanding and the behavioral uptake. The fact that I realized that when I had a fight with my husband, it was not because we really needed that fight or we really meant everything. That was already a level of sophistication to even, put up post-it to say, hey, don't have a serious discussion when you don't sleep enough. And that's a kind of interventions that would come from the self, so that there's no resistance to these effective interventions. So the mindset really also need to be trained, but not, by preaching, because that's not going to work, right? So what are the ones that methods out there that have been most successful? Games, in engaging people and getting them to repeat and practice and learn from it, using, experiential kind of learnings instead of boring information that just, go off the mind, once that information session is over. So the simulated and even more fascinatingly personalized way of discovery. They have their own narratives going about it. They take their own speed. There's so much autonomy. They can feel proud of that process. They own that process. It lasts. It goes into that, more automatic system and memory for those lessons learned. So this is the other part. There's lots of potential for embedding games in physical and digital space that would upgrade the human capacity. But it's important for us to identify which factors really matter in terms of our capacity to make a good impact on our well-being outcome. So last but not least, if we think about a new approach that is really based on fact, personalized learning, can we think about a living lab, in a physical space or digital space, where we embed, all of these cutting-edge interventions, but also tweak, iterate, and use a evidence-based approach. And two simple rules of thumb or principles to take with is, what is a scientific diagnosis that's not just based on intuition? If you think about a workplace, if we would intuitively think about it, we think about bonuses and training and all of those that we are feeling comfortable with. We might have witnessed, we might have personal data that it worked in the past. And it turns out that if you look at the scientific evidence and data, it might look drastically different than what you intuitively think. In this particular data set created by BE Works during the COVID-19, you see the tool identifies trust to be the number one differentiator of less productive and more productive employees, and that people are also still very productive without all of these offices and working from home, and that trust really matters. Now, would we have ever thought about that? How would we actually design a workplace that has most trust? Why is it the first time that we ever discussed about it? And in fact, this makes a lot of business case, even though in the past it has been rather intangible. So then, as and behavioral scientists collected all of this data and actually really invested in a fund that consists of psychological behavioral factors that together perform 12% better than the S&P 500 indexes. And the factors taken into account, it's not intuitive. If you think about these four factors, which ones are the better performing ones? It's not special recognition and training. It's clear expectations and honest mistakes valued. And that comes from the data. So I think I'm excited about all of the disciplines coming together and take a very holistic approach. COVID-19 really helps us not to be tied to the old normals and have this courage to take a new lens at where we are, what really matters, and that we can maybe with that change, with everything turning upside down, acknowledge what we can do and what we have not done that we could have done to really get out of the dark ages and enter a new age of human flourishing. And we need to realize that This is both an opportunity, but also where we are far, far.
We've got a long way to go. But it's exciting though.
We're
and I think
starting.
you're interested in working with architects and urban planners and a whole bunch of different groups in different parts of the world to really help say, how could we do an intentional experiment, not just the almost accidental experiments of like COVID and things. How can we be intentional? But how can we actually pilot? You know, I love that twin cities idea, right? The idea that you have a common health practice in the middle, but you've got one control, they just do what they do. And you've got one that you're doing little subtle interventions based on stuff we know from science, but it's more evidence-based. And let's actually do that and treat, you know, cities as a living laboratory, but help, don't turn people into lab rats. I think it's actually let people be the experimenters, but let them build on best practices that you're already learning. And in some ways, it feels like the soft sciences that, you know, a lot of people dismiss as soft science are the hardest sciences of all, because they're so intangible. It's it's meaning and the mind, and we all think we're experts, then we fall for some other fallacy, you know. This is great. And we're just so glad you could join us, and we're hoping you're able to participate as this initiative moves forward.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I'm excited.
Next up, Netta Tamir. So she's my boss. I'm her intern, and we've been working together for a few years. She's a PhD candidate at Cornell. Her undergrad was in cognitive psychology, and she's now focusing on human-computer interaction, and particularly how machines might help humans build their cognitive capacity and actually just kind of have quantified self for the space between our ears, you know, and our maybe build regenerative cognitive capacity. So please welcome Netta Tamir. No, thanks for joining. I'm excited to see you. It looks like you're in lovely Tel Aviv. Let's jump in. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what's the research we've been working on.
Hi, Mickey. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. So I'm Netta. I'm a PhD student at Cornell University, and for the past years, I've been working with Mickey on some really cool and fun stuff. And we're gonna share with you some small bits of it. We hope you're gonna like it. So we were very interested in understanding the role that cognition plays in our life, and more specifically in our decision-making process. And in order to understand better the context of that, we decided to create an information architecture model for that kind of process. So as human beings, we usually have goals, may them be small or big, but that's what drives us throughout our days. And in order to achieve those goals, we decide on certain activities and actions to take. But those activities are very much affected by many factors that are constantly in a role. It can be our identity and the history, our past experiences, the current state we're at right now. We might be a bit depressed, you know, going through what we're going right now is very difficult and taxing on our mood. So that might have big effect on our actions, the preferences and our needs. But also we have the context itself, right? Right now, for example, I'm sitting on a rooftop in Tel Aviv. There's cars that are honking, and a small, very good baby that is playing here. So obviously, it affects my thinking right now, my cognition. But we also have the time of day, the when. It can be in the morning or in the afternoon. If you're a morning person, there are certain things you should do in the morning and not wait till the evening. And there's also whom we're doing the activity with, the act with. And people will help us in certain things and some less. And there's also externalities, events that are beyond our control, like government policies. But we also have the resources. We have the artifacts that we're using to deliver a message or make a decision. For example, right now, I'm using a presentation to show you some of the work that Vicky and I are working on. There's methods and skills that we've acquired throughout our life. And we have our cognition, those small things that basically is the fuel for everything we're doing. And the interesting thing is that they're all affecting each other, and which means that it's very much a dynamic process that has so many small factors. And what we mentioned here are just the big ones, the main things we chose. But there are many other things that are affecting our decision process. And remember, we started with saying that we're very much interested in the role that cognition plays in all of that. So let's first explain really quickly what cognitive capacity is. So cognitive capacity is the amount of information we are able to process in a certain time, and it's finite. So we can look at it as 100%. It's like a gas tank. And when we say cognitive load, we mean the amount of information we are processing at a certain moment for a specific task. And that's a very subjective thing. And the interesting thing is that for the past 50,000 years, at least, our cognitive capacity hasn't changed at all. However, back then, we only needed to worry about shelter, safety, and making sure we have enough food to eat. In modern times, we started to practice hobbies and more complicated jobs. And today, we have all those technologies around us that constantly fight for our attention, which causes a cognitive overload. So it's no surprise that most of us experiencing burnout, right? We end the day feeling so exhausted, we barely have energy to go out with friends at the end of the workday. And it didn't used to be like that, and it shouldn't be like that. Now, before you get all depressed about that, we do believe we can do something about it. What if we could have a juice meter, a meter that will help us track and manage our cognitive resources better? You can think of it as a cognitive dashboard that will walk us through the day. So if we're looking at a very regular office workday, you can see that around 10-ish, there's a prep meeting. I think it's Mickey's schedule, by the way. So Mickey has a very important meeting here, and you can see that it's very taxing on his cognitive load. And you can see he's around 78%. But then around 1-ish, he's taking a lunch break and he can chill a bit. It's more relaxing. However, his cognitive reserve has dropped down to 60 by that point. But then he has this one-on-one meeting. At the end of the day, around 5, he's already at 32% of his fuel tank, and he needs to make very important decisions. And that might be a problem. There's a study that coined the term decision fatigue. There was a study that was conducted with judges on deciding on parole. The study showed that at the beginning of the day, the judges were much more understanding and compassionate and tended to give a lot more paroles. But as the day progressed, they became less understanding. And then when they took a break, they came back and they again they were understanding and more compassionate. But there's also a good side to things. There's also activities we can do that will help us regenerate our cognition, like hobbies or just doing something different. Like the judges, they took a break, it regenerated them. They were more freshened up and back to their game. But we can also, we also know that sports plays a crucial part in regenerating our cognition and a good night's sleep. So if we can track all those things and learn what's best for us, for our subjective cognitive usage, we can improve our well-being or the way we manage ourselves much better. So taking all that, we envision that we'll have a dashboard that will show us kind of a summary at the end of the day of what was your cognitive usage, what were the activities that consume the most. So here you can see an example of my own cognitive usage, and that's just an estimate. We did not do a study on that yet, but I believe that that's the way that I consume my cognition. And you can see that reading consumed a lot of cognition. Now you might think that it means that I just read a lot of hours. Well, that's not the case. You see, I'm a dyslexic person. So for me, anything related to reading or writing is very taxing on my cognition. So even if I'm spending 30 minutes, it's gonna consume a lot. And I learned that for me, it's best if I start the day doing reading and writing and leave the remainder of the day for things that are much more easier for me and less taxing on my cognition. So you can, with time, as we gather more data, we can learn about the activities we're doing and kind of manage the time of day we're going to do it, how much time, with whom. So remember, I talked about the fact that I'm dyslexic. For thinking about the potential it holds for working in groups, then the fact, for example, that I just had to read this morning a bunch of stuff because I'm doing a PhD and I spend most of my time reading stuff, you can see that I'm already depleted at the end of the day. However, Mickey is not freshen up because for him, reading
is like super early in the morning, right? Yeah, and I also love reading. Like I fall into book, and I was raised in a reading family, and I don't have this. I have other challenges, but I don't have a problem with that. In fact, maybe when we team up, I end up having the energy that you're lagging. I mean, it's later in the day for you. It's super early in the morning for me. So time of day matters. So this is kind of fun. How do we team up? And maybe the point in this is we don't want to necessarily look at yet another dashboard all the time. We want to kind of have a baseline, and then we want it to fade in the background, but help us sort of build habits where we're actually working together with people that complement us, that give us sort of cognitive diversity and the ability to really get the best out of all of us. So Netta, what might this look like in the physical space? What might this look like if we were actually thinking about a new kind of way of building a community or even an office or a meeting or something like that?
So, the basic thing is that if I'm very depleted and you are not, then if we're team up, we can do a good job on maybe a task that we must do right now. But if we're thinking more further to the future, the room can read us. The room can sense that we're getting depleted, and maybe we can shake things up. Maybe the room should change the structure of it. Maybe now, instead of sitting around the table will go down and we'll have whiteboards coming up from the ground, and we'll continue the meeting while drawing things and talking and moving around the room. Maybe the room can change the whole way it looks. Maybe it will look like now we're in the forest. A change of scenery.
Or maybe it recommends to go walk in the real forest, right? Maybe it says this should be a walking meeting. And, I love this idea and this potential. I think ultimately we want the intelligence in the room, let's call it ambient intelligence. These days, if you go to an Amazon Go store, it's kind of a robot that you go inside of, right? Like when you go in, it's got cameras looking at it. It can dissect, did I buy one of these? Did I buy two of these? It's like robots we live within. How do we help them or have them not shape us in bad ways, but how do we have personal information nobody else knows about, but then help suggest better ways? So it could even say something like, don't even go into this meeting. Like you're burned out, like take a break, sleep, they'll be fine without you. Or what if it could say, wow, I've noticed Mickey talks all the time, and the person with really good ideas hasn't said one word. He's just hogging the conversation. So how do we have the room kind of encourage turn taking? Or just look at the artifacts. If you were drawing and I was drawing, are we drawing together? or are we miscommunicating? You know, do we think we're talking about the same thing or not? So there are a lot of potentials here. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'm hoping we can just get back to doing the research and maybe do some interesting pilots with a whole bunch of other people.
Thank you, Mickey, and I had a great teacher, so thank you, and thank you all. Stay safe.
I had a great boss, so that's good.
Hope you enjoy it.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Next up, it's Palti, and he'll take us through the looking glass to think about what a city could be if it becomes conscious. It's welcome. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So can you tell us just a little bit about yourselves and what you're doing at your lab and at your design studio? I'm really pretty fascinated by your sort of point of view on this.
Thank you. Yeah, so I work at the intersection of architecture and neuroscience, and that has a few implications, both in culture change in the built environment. So how do we change the way we design? How do we change our relationship with space? And on a practical level, also, how do we create the methodologies and the proofs of concepts that there is a different way to design? We specifically use cognitive science, behavioral science, to inform our design process, but also to create a new type of relationship between person and space.
So a new type of relationship, just real quick before we jump into your presentation. What would be a relationship you'd love to see between people and a space?
Well, I think the way that we build currently is that we see a space or a place as an end product of a design process. And I find that problematic because really the relationship of person and space begins when it's, you know, when there are people there using it, inhabiting the spaces. And therefore, the work that I do and we do at HUME and the Center for Conscious Design also tries to rethink this relationship, because we understand that it's the use of the space and the evolution of the space over time which has a really significant effect on people's health, well-being, productivity, all the things we want to talk about. And it's very strange that actually people involved in design leave these spaces.
Isn't that weird?
They're on there. Right. So through the looking glass, I'm starting off with this idea that we are able to see the world in a different way to what we're used to seeing. And part of this is built out of our understanding of cognition in humans. In that, in the past, we as a scientific community thought that the brain was the kind of central engine that was not so connected to the rest of our body or the outside world and so on. Over time, we've understood that we can look at cognition much more fluidly. So think about the fact that you use your telephone to remember things, to speak to people. You might put your sunglasses on the door handle to remind yourself to go out. And we use buildings as our tools and also as a way to extend our intent. So think about how you look around your space. How did you position different things around your space? That's your intent, having a manifestation on the space. And everywhere you look around you, including places that you don't control, are representations of someone's intent or groups of people's intent to shape an experience. And so this connection between mind, body, space, and the way that these things are fluid gives us a different way to look at and assess our relationship with place. What is this space around us? What does it mean? What is it trying to do? And we recognize that design is a decision-making process, meaning each of the points of decisions in that process is a hypothesis that we say we believe doing X will have Y effect, or probability that there is a Y effect. So I am saying, let's redefine architecture, and I've taken this famous saying, architecture is frozen music. I'm saying architecture is frozen intent. And through that looking glass, we can start understanding what spaces are and what design is, everywhere you look around it. So intent to welcome, intent to include people, for example, intent to keep out as well. The intent isn't always good. Intent to empower. So this is an example, personal example from my city, Tel Aviv. We have Rabin Square in Tel Aviv, which was designed within the brief with the intent to house over at least 40,000 protesters in front of City Hall. That's intent to empower democracy and intent to empower the voice of the people.
Wow.
The space is empty in the day-to-day, but it has to be empty for it to be able to house that volume of demonstration, large amounts of people. Take Trafalgar Square as another example. The two fountains that you see on the left and right, they're huge fountains that take up a large amount of floor space. They were installed there in 1840 something, 5 I think, to repress mass gatherings. So take up more space in your public square means less people can gather there. And so here is a hidden intent to repress. It's hidden within the beauty of a fountain, but the intent is something else. And so you use this lens to look at your city. When you walk around the city and think about how it affects you. First of all, as we see it through our scientific lens, cognition. So how does space affect our cognition? That's our attention capacity, our creative thinking, the way we might empathize even. And how does it affect our metacognition, where it relates to our identity, our sense of belonging, our knowing of ourselves within the city and within our context. And the city has the power to do all these things. Conscious Cities was based on the idea of the right to the city by Henry Lefebvre, and this is a really nice take by David Harvey on it, saying far more than the individual liberty to access urban resources, it is a right to change ourselves by changing the city. And I think this right is something that we need to ask whether we are exercising that right or whether we are being given the option to exercise our right. Whose intent are we living in? When you go into the street, is it your intent? Is it the intent of the community around you? Or is it the intent of a small number of people who are making decisions in perhaps somewhere divorced from your reality? I'm not going to say what my opinion is, but let's say there's a variety of these situations. Part 2, making the invisible visible. The power of science as it currently is with technology to allow us to understand what a space creates as part of an experience and measure it as well. So we look at spaces that we love and we go to. Their intent was to create a sense of curiosity, a sense of awe, perhaps bring people together. These are buildings that we flock to, but would not be commissioned right in today. They weren't probably commissioned that much in that period as well, and this is Gaudi in Barcelona. Why? Because how can you commission something that you can't measure? So we commission things and we think about things in the way that we can measure. So streets, when we put the metric of success as movement as an example, we strip it and we engineer anything out of it that doesn't serve that purpose. And so we strip our streets and engineer serendipity out of them because they might be lowering that metric that we've attached to it, which is how many cars speed through it, how many bikes, how many whatever. But the choice of metrics creates an evolution of space. So you look at how airplane seats in front of our eyes over the years get narrower and narrower. Sorry, that slide went through. But the reason for it is that the metric attached to it is number of passengers or profits, and therefore the space evolves over time according to that. Sometimes we can't help it. We're given all sorts of ways to measure the world and speak to the others about it objectively, and that affects the way that we look at what is possible, what's possible to measure, what's possible to affect, what's possible to talk about. Many people might think science is there to replace design. When we talk about science-informed design, it's not. Science cannot design. What it can do is shift design from efficient to effective. And that means getting rid of old metrics that create a mechanical relationship with space, and creating new metrics that speak to the human experience and human well-being. So we're adding human metrics to all the existing metrics that we already have, which sometimes represent, but often don't represent the human experience. And human metrics can be many different things: behavioral, physiological, cognitive, metacognitive. These are all things that we are able to draw from scientific research to give us context of how does this fit within a design process. Also a scale on the level from individual to society, as you can see here. Part 3, what's in a city? So here I'm going to take these two kind of ideas. First of all, the lens to look at architecture as intent. Secondly, this way of measuring the human experience and how that's going to affect us. And I'm going to start with a very simple example, which is, how does knowing about the content of food affect our consumption? And we know that most of us in our lives also saw the period where there was no indication of what's in food, and we know what happened when we started seeing the numbers. Our consumption changed. And so this is what's happening to architecture. We are starting to put numbers to the invisible, and it's starting to change what people expect of spaces. The three articles on the right are related to the Conscious Cities movement, which I lead, and change is there to change the way we see the built environment. The third one, the final one on the left, is interesting because sick building syndrome is something that once you give a name to it, you're able to talk about it, you're able to even sue people for its effects, and therefore it has very direct effect on consumption. And so you say, okay, when we know what we're actually experiencing in the way that we know what we're eating, we might think differently about space. That works also in the other way. So information that comes in about the health benefits of nature is to state to us, nature affects us in a positive way, restores our attention capacity, brings calm to our lives, perspective, relaxation, and we start attributing those things to nature because of what science is telling us. And so we start saying, okay, so nature is good for us, therefore I must surround myself with nature and everything that comes from nature. But it raises a question, because it almost ignores the fact most of the time that we live and experience space through changes of social contracts. We are in the city and we are in the street, and the social contract there is efficiency and movement and business, and if that's not what you're doing, then it's not right. It's not right to speak to a stranger in the street, because who has time for that? You're in the street, it's about efficiency. But studies that talk about parks and people's behaviors in parks and nature talk about pro-social behavior. Attributing, in my opinion, pro-social behavior to greenery in itself, I'm not sure is completely robust, because it ignores this fact that there is a social contract of when you are in nature, you are enjoying yourself, you are relaxed, you speak to people, you are not working, and you are not taking part in this machine of efficiency that the streets are projecting. And so we look at this approach commodifies nature and says, you go to nature in the same way that you take medicine. Go to nature for X amount of time and you will get this benefit. These are just some dialogue between city and nature that I like. I'm going to give an example of what it means to talk about the nature of nature and how we can embed it into our cities. This is an example in Tel Aviv. In this case, it's a park. The next example I'm going to give is almost devoid of nature. But what's interesting about this park is that, yes, it's green. We can call it nature in some ways, but it's actually the serendipity and the exploration and the events that are designed into the space that create the same law of nature. That means, for example, every day the fountain overflows, a small stream runs through the whole park and ends in a pond. So kids love to go there at 5 p.m. every day and see this thing. When they were building it, they hid all sorts of treasures within the soil so that kids could explore and dig and find them. And I even have one myself, even though I'm not a kid, well, not age-wise.
I love this idea. It's kind of like it's like a treasure hunt, you know, built in, and it means that it's the opposite of what you said earlier, right? That architecture is frozen intent. It almost is like the kids actually bring intent to it by digging, they change the architecture. I love this. Wow.
Right. They enact it. So the theory of enactivism in architecture is that it's also the person that acts on affordances and creates the opportunity and creates the experience. And so you could say it's not frozen intent, but it's absolutely the intent of the designer to create the nature of nature and for children to enjoy exploration, and something that doesn't exist in the street. You do not explore in the street. You do not find serendipity in the street. And this is a question, right? So this is a project I worked on called Urban Thingscape in Philadelphia, and we worked with two child psychologists, Kathy Hirsch-Patrick, Roberta Gollingoff, who pioneered the science of playful learning. So child development works better through play in many different ways. And so we translated the science of that, and we created a space for play, exploration, interactions between caregiver and child at a spot where people wait for the bus. So we take places where you know, a parent and child be sitting on their smartphones and not talking, and we give them the opportunity to use that time to interact and explore and so on. So here is something that, yes, there are plants in there, but the nature of nature here in terms of its serendipity, its playfulness, its exploration is there in design and part of the urban fabric. And so
I love this. Yeah. Well, and it also, you make me think of, you know, you started with through the looking glass, you know, how do we go into a different space? And now you're kind of wrapping with the nature of nature. And it feels like you're talking about human nature as well, right? And not just this kind of artificial idea of pro-social behavior coming out of a park or something, but really kind of allowing human nature to shape the intent. And I wrote down inactivism. I thought that was an interesting word. Like, I'd never heard that before, but I that you enact, you know, you actually, it reminds me a little bit of tactical urban prototyping, you know, which is something that happens a lot in San Francisco. Sometimes, you know, surprisingly. So let's wrap this up. Where are you at in terms of, you know, things that you'd like to share, maybe a last slide or two, and also what do you want to provoke the attendees? You know, what kind of either provocation or pilot or experiment would you love to run, and what do you see as an opportunity for a sort of a wise city, thriving city?
Okay, so the project that I showed you, we were solving a problem. It is in a promised zone in Philadelphia where children come from disadvantaged neighborhoods and enter education with a word gap. We understood there was an opportunity to use the space to solve this problem, and we carried out a method which also included impact assessment to prove the worth of this investment on social return. So how does it affect child development and so on? I think we have a lot of issues that we need to solve in our cities. You can talk about what COVID has done, but to me, those issues, the issues are the very same issues that were there before COVID. Loneliness, problems in belonging, lack of community, lack of trust. And I think that as a provocation, I will say, all of these things may be a result of the way that we treat our shared spaces as a place for efficiency and not for experience and solving all the issues we want. And so I want to ask about, can we look at what we are drawn to in nature, curiosity, exploration, and so on? Can we embed that into our streets in a way that is both effective for the experience of the people and affects their health and well-being, and also create the economic models that show that this is a worthwhile way to reshape our cities.
I love it.
And so I'll finish off on this quote from Einstein to say, now that we're starting to count the right things, let's use it. And that's probably my message here, my provocation.
I love it. Well, thank you so much. You know, Atai, you've given me like a ton of ideas, right? From inactivism to moving from effective to or efficient to effective, to this notion of let's not just do this kind of artificial apply. Parks are where you have fun, period. This is where you get things done, you know, kind of thing. But also this notion that a place just begins to be the architecture when it's actually used, when it starts to accrete memory. And I loved your I loved having Spock there, because I think he's our kind of icon for the tension between trying to be logical and count everything, but also yeah.
I love it when people notice that, because it's a hidden fault in the slide, because Spock is rational, so most of those things don't count for him. Usually I give it as a quiz, but you spotted it without.
Yeah, well, and I think, you know, I always thought of Kirk, Spock, and McCoy as being just different people inside of your head. You know, Kirk was this sort of super passionate, come on, let's go. And, you know, Spock was rational, and then McCoy was the kind of smart, you know, smart aleck, I guess. So who would you love to work with? You know, if you could have a different kind of discipline, or a different, you know, somebody that's not in your world, but you think is really important, like the kinds of other teammates, other disciplines you'd love to participate in a pilot, you'd love to do a prototype with around kind of this idea of a different kind of a street, for example.
Yeah, so I think the type of people I work with and want to continue working with are those in organizations that can pivot towards an evidence base and towards a different way of understanding effectiveness. That might mean redefining what productivity is. It might mean redefining what the street is for. Redefining what a community is. And we have a way to translate all this scientific knowledge into very useful information, and to use technology to create a much more direct dialogue that can have a huge effect on how people perceive their agency and relationship with space, and also with the other people who inhabit those spaces.
I love it. Well, thank you so much, Atai, and I'm looking forward to kind of what people come up with and how this evolves. You know, this conference is just sort of step one of the dream that I think Nicole and Mistletoe and the organizations that are helping this are coming forward with. I'd love to see some actual prototyping come out of it. So I'm looking forward to see what people come up with.
Absolutely, thank you. It's been great. I'm looking forward to seeing what happens in this initiative. I think it's a great initiative, and I'm interested to take.
Well, and thanks for inspiring us with this idea of a movement around conscious cities. I think it's kind of beautiful.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mick, and thank you for the team for giving us kind of a new framing to look at how we might go about the task of creation in our cities. Let's bring back Beth Coleman. Hello, Beth. And also joining us is Ting. Hi, Ting.
Hi.
Oh,
Hey,
great.
Hi, Beth. Hi,
you
Peter. Can you hear me?
Yeah. What city are you in today?
Durham, North Carolina, with
excellent.
the tall trees and singing birds and an owl.
It's you know, it is great that we are coming up on the solstice, because here we are well into the evening where you are, but it's still light.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Hey, so today's show really got into this notion of minds and meaning, and Ting, you put on this table the notion that, okay, for 500 years, we've had a scientific revolution.
Yeah.
And we've gotten very good at the enlightenment and all this stuff. But when it actually comes to the science of understanding ourselves and what motivates us, we're at the very beginning, but it's now becoming science, something we can work with. And then this question of maybe this expands beyond just the frame of our self, our quantified self, into our city, right? And that's that's an amazing way of stretching our minds of what we might do.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and Peter, I also, have been thinking about this very hard for the past few months of why we are so receptive to medical sciences and other kind of sciences, and why are we having a hard time, making use of the science about ourselves. And one of the lessons that I have learned from behavioral economics is that we rely on thinking shortcuts. So we call it heuristics and biases. And it is exactly some of these biases that are derailing us. And so if we think about, status quo bias, what it means is that we're comfortable with what we're familiar with, and we are, because it's energy efficient. So unless we are in a crisis, we will not think of, drastic ways of changing our lives, because the past ways of what we're familiar with already work well. So it's a lot of risk to take, and it is rational most of the time, but it does mean that, we are averse to major changes, and we're also averse to uncertainty. So there's a uncertainty bias, ambiguity bias. So Einstein's quote, where Itai ended with, not everything, counts, can be, not everything that is countable counts, and not everything counts can be countable. And there, because some of these well-being impacts are so invisible and intangible, we ended up not, spending efforts in capturing it. And so I think if we manage to pause and really want the awakening, we need to, first of all, really deeply acknowledge and accept the fact that we are subject to our biases in our daily decision, including, the most important decisions in designing our lives for well-being, for ourselves. Otherwise, we'll fill our schedule. We're very busy doing with things we perceive to be great, but don't give us the most fulfilling meaning, even though we feel comfortable with it.
And Beth, as we will see in this conference tomorrow, and as you and Poppy discussed today, we are deploying an enormous amount of sensing and technology that, if but we apply it to this form of personal improvement, personal betterness, happiness, performance, we can get a lot done there. There's this tantalizing notion that that this ability, these things that can help us achieve more, or make better decisions, are now being deployed, or can be deployed very widely in the physical environment and in cities, which either means that our cities and our rooms and our spaces can help us achieve more, or they'll surveil us, right? So there's kind of a razor edge between those two things.
Yeah, I mean, I was super stimulated by what Ting had to say during the conference, and also just now, because the human factors around thresholds and comforts are important in thinking about how can we manage this well, what's the conversation, because the technology is really ready and able to go, but it's going to be pointed in the wrong direction or not have the right intention in its design and how it's used, to borrow some of Poppy's language, unless we address some of these, I don't know, socio-technological issues around trust, transparency, agency, and relation. For us to be able to use AI well, it doesn't mean we're going to know how the neural net works. So we don't. So we need to know some other things about kind of the system view to say, yes, this is where we're going with this.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to Peter,
go ahead.
To add to Beth's point, Einstein has another quote that if he has to spend an hour solving any problem, he will spend 55 minutes trying to diagnose where the problems really are, and only 5 minutes coming up with the solutions. I don't think we have, and maybe we do, and Peter, I'm curious to hear both you and Beth's opinion. Do we have a consensus of what, for example, determines well-being in terms of factors that we should have looked at and we have not, the blind spots, right? What are the most, if there's one factor we're going to take, is it about building, you know, green nature around our environment, or is it about solving loneliness? And in fact, in a lot of the scientific research, we already know the answer. But if you would share this with you know, everybody on the planet and ask them to vote, I'm sure that there's a split answer even in that, right? So I think we're not taking some of these soft sciences as serious as medical science, even that they mean life and death to us. And I'm very scared by that sort of, you know, blindness to facts, and I worry about that.
Yeah, I mean, to build on Ting's point, that contact tracing has become really an app, a tech solve around where we are with COVID, but we see ongoingly that it's often seniors in homes where the problem is, and that's not a contact tracing issue. That's infrastructure around what protections do people have and who's vulnerable. So sometimes the technology is a distraction.
Welcome, Mick.
Hey, everybody. Glad to be back.
Yeah, you know, your COVID point there on technology distraction. This really does get to the core of what problem we're trying to solve, right? Because if you actually look at how the scientific process has evolved in the last 4 months of COVID, right? There was a sense early on that, yeah, you needed data and contact tracing, and you know, that's gotten more refined. And then nobody early on kind of understood the degree to which there was elder loneliness and how that isolation was magnified. You know, there's just a whole bunch of things that we're just beginning to understand and can probably be best understood as a very rich system. And you could also, I think, much of the stuff that has caused huge disagreement and anxiety in the whole COVID response is the fact that we're barely able to understand the system, or because data keeps coming in, because, you know, exactly what is the mortality of it or how does it spread. Scientists are constantly updating and revising things, and it's very difficult for people to kind of keep up with that form of the scientific method. And then where do we even pour that into a model or something so we can understand how to prioritize that? It's just a kind of a stunning example of how all this stuff fits together. And, you know, my own mind, every day you get up and it's a different set of assumptions about things. So.
Yeah. Peter, and I also think there's a difference between data science and science about the mind and decision making, and about what contributes to our well-being, right? So you can have the data of like 80% of people are not washing hands in a way that we want, but then how do you get them to really adhere to hand washing, or how do you get people to adhere to wearing masks? There's actually scientific techniques behind, but just because it sounds intuitive, doesn't sound like you know, bleeding or breaking leg, where we have no knowledge about where we would then seek experts or, you know, expertise. Here are something that we can contribute with opinions, and we kind of just miss out on these scientific,
I think this notion that because we're human and we have an awful lot of opinions about how other humans should live, because we're inside of this body, we must be experts. But there's this sort of fallacy of expertise, because we read about something, we're like, I get it, and then we don't really do it. It's the curse of intuition, and I think we need to enter this world with a lot more humble understanding. You know, I was reading a history book recently about vampires. So one of the signers of the Constitution, I know this seems like a non sequitur, but give me a second. One of the signers of a Constitution was one of the biggest bloodletters in the world. And, you know, the Lancet, the medical journal, is named after basically draining you of blood, being a vampire. Because at the time, we were in sort of the dark ages of understanding what works. And in fact, Washington, you know, our first president of the United States, George Washington, died from bloodletting by a vampire who literally, I mean, at the time, he was the best we had. He was like this voodoo guy who was known and signed the Constitution he's one of the signers, who was known as this grand scientist doctor, and he believed when George Washington was fairly sick, they called him in because he was a great doctor, and he was like, well, clearly we have to balance his humors. Let's drain more blood out of him. And so they drained blood out of him. You know, they put leeches on and they put a lancet in and they drained him. And then he didn't get better. And they were like, well, that's not working. Let's drain more blood. So they drained more blood out of him. And then finally they're like, that's not working. Get a young sheep from Washington's flock. This is all true. Let's go give George Washington a transfusion from this young, virile, lamb or sheep or whatever, because clearly that is the way to cure the president of our country. And they brought a sheep in and they connected basically a tube from a young sheep, and they basically exsanguinated the sheep to put fresh young blood, because that would balance the humors for George Washington, into his arm, and he died. So, and that's what the medical journals were back in the Dark Ages, as you talked about, Ting.
Yeah.
The Lancet is named after bleeding people, like to help balance the humors. Like, we didn't understand much about science. We are in that same dark age for the space between our brains. And we're celebrating these people who come up with these crazy ideas. They're like, oh, if you just follow Tony Robbins, and I don't know if he's good. I mean, he was actually an investor in one of my companies. I don't want to say necessarily negative things, but is there science there, or is he just really compelling? And when he works with you one-on-one, just the act of having that much attention is amazing. We don't know, and I think the scientific method is hard. And humans are high dimensionality, right? So it's, how am I alone?
Yeah.
How am I when I interact with Ting? How do I interact differently with Beth, with Peter? How do we interact as four of us? Four of us is weird. How do we understand the social model of you, me, and what Beth thinks about Peter, and what Beth thinks Peter thinks about Ting? These get exponential very quickly. And yet what you've discovered and what your team has discovered is all sorts of like real, demonstrable, repeatable, scientific ways of helping us actually either build capacity with internal choice architecture, or external capacity, like change the environment, put the food. You were telling me about Google, just moving the food. Tell us about that.
18 feet versus 6 feet.
Made a difference.
Drastically reduce of unhealthy snacking. Even
Just
wrapping
move
the
it 18
M&M.
feet versus 6 feet.
Yeah.
That's it. Just
Right.
move the architecture a little bit in the cafeteria, and you get healthier eating.
And I think other important point is that we do have individuality in this matter that is very different than bleeding or breaking legs, where the solution could be just universal and standardized. That partly explains the difficulty.
We shouldn't bleed people to death, but
there are universal laws about what matters for well-being, but to what degrees it actually helps a person. For example, listening to music or doing yoga or doing which kind of exercise, it really has 1,000 versions, different from person to person. So we do need the autonomous participation,
we need
from the individuals, and we need to have the compressible inputs from the individual of what they like, etc., and encourage them to share their authentic self, interacting with the artificial intelligence, interacting with all the digitalization around us. But we do need to realize that the individuality is also what blocks us from seeking the universality of the science behind. And
so there's some broad things, because we are all human, that actually just work, that make us feel better, that make us get up. You were doing an experiment with a very large, or a pilot with a very large group of elderly people in the Netherlands, I think.
We started with exercising and adding hidden gyms, and we piggyback, for example, standing on one leg while they brush teeth, to their toothbrushing habit. And it turns out, that's a very technical insight that is not so obvious to people, that with the new habit, it's much easier if you kind of piggyback it after old habit.
Okay.
And starting with, and we had I think 7 times increase in that exercise uptake. So sometimes it can be very, very simple without themselves knowing, right? So I think the difficulty with the intent sometimes is that we thought that we know what's good for us, in terms of well-being. And I think we need to separate what we know, that they truly only we know ourselves individually, and what other things that we can, build on science. If we can separate those two, we can,
I don't know if you said this or Dan or somebody in the behavioral science space, but he said a bad habit is easy to make and hard to live with, and a good habit is hard to make and easy to live with. And we need to create a slippery slope towards good habits the same way we kind of fall down slippery slope towards bad. It doesn't change overnight. We need to move from that system to where we got to think about it all the time to habit, and it takes a while. That's why I think you talked about gaming, and I love this idea that it is visceral enough to matter. You're playing something that you're a character, you're trying to win, but it's fair because of rules, and you get to try it over and over again. You showed me some stats from that Kenya study that you did, where happiness, it was called happy money. They could build this kind of pile of happiness, a stack of happiness. But you measured their decision myopia about economic decisions before playing the game. Would they spend the money on giving it to their husband to get some alcohol? Would they spend it on investing in insurance to make sure that if something bad happened to their kid? And it was like -7. They were super myopic. Like they just couldn't really think about their future selves. But by playing the game, it was visceral enough that it mattered. And over the gameplay, I don't know, 2 or 3 times, you showed a stat that they actually were able to reduce myopia because they were building, they were building their own capacity for economic decision making. So there are things we can do. Now, Beth, you look like you've got a strong.
I need to sign off because.
Okay.
But I just wanted to add to this. Part of scientific method and science Western context is it's experimental. So we conclude, we find, but the conclusion is always contingent on until we know more.
Yeah.
And that part of it, until we know more, I would like to see how we can infuse that spirit of until we know more. This is the best we understand. This is the best practice. So, I mean, poor George Washington kind of sucks. But that was your point.
At the time,
At the time, and this idea of until we know more, if we could build that into not just science instead of it being a battering ram or a hammer saying, oh, this is intelligence, and we can measure it, or there are some things, I mean, do we want to talk about gravity? Do we want to talk about quantum physics that we're just like, yeah, I'm not really going to argue against that. There are other things that we're just like, well, until we know more. I mean, quantum physics, until we know more.
I love that idea. Until we know more.
But how can we build greater capacity of until we know more in other parts of kind of our societal growth? And King's point that change is hard and people don't do it unless there's crisis. I mean, we're seeing that. The evidence of that is all around us because we're in crisis mode now. But is there a way that we can facilitate until we know more into a livable, sustainable practice and not crisis mode? And with that, I exit.
You got to run.
I want to hear your response.
Nice. And then drop the mic. That's good. That's good. But I think this notion of until we know more, it's that the first thing a scientist has to do is question themselves. Like actually, what are all the ways that this experiment might have fooled you by coincidence? And that the great scientists are very humble about, look, this worked, but only in this frame. And until we know more, until we actually have some repeatability and we can see some robustness.
And the new opportunity is also the personalized big data that is going to be made possible. And it will allow a lot of self-experimentation of what works for us. So I think to Beth's point, absolutely, it can become the new normal that we experiment with our own lives, even like taking a shower in the morning versus evening. What works better for your sleep?
Let's do it.
Hey, what does work
Good
better?
night, everyone.
All right, Beth, thank you.
Great to see you.
Mick, why don't we tease what's going to go on Friday, and who our special guests are going to be?
Yeah, so I'm very excited by this. So Michael Ford, and if you happen to read the New York Times on Saturday, there was actually a short write-up about what Michael Ford is doing. Michael Ford is the hip hop architect. And I met him at Autodesk because Autodesk Tinkercad, which is just a sort of tool for kids from 6 years old to 60 to 70 years old, learn how to begin making things. It's a free tool that everybody can use. 10 or so million people a month use it. Just Tinkercad. Well, Autodesk is really interested in kind of how do we help democratize creativity and building things and learning agency through making. Just making stuff. And so they've sponsored Michael Ford's hip hop architecture camps. And he's going to be joining us Friday to tell us about an initiative that's starting in August. He has quit his day job and he is planning on building an army of hip hop architects. And it's pretty bold and exciting. He brings hip hop artists and he basically says, look, they are doing the post-occupancy survey of architecture. And they've done it for 50 years. They're telling you how wrong, how bad our environments, our cities are, our neighborhoods are. They are telling you, but instead of us dancing along to this great story of how screwed up and how architecture has become the backdrop for systemic racism and violence, how do we actually enlist those just brilliant thinkers that are actually having lyrical complexity? How do we enlist them with high school kids, with grammar school kids, and actually build a movement of hip hop architects? And why this is important is only in America, and Michael Ford's a Black architect in Madison, Wisconsin, who quit his day job because he couldn't actually even agree with what the architectural studio was doing. He basically said, we are building the backdrop for unjust cities. So he's going to talk on Friday about just cities and how we enlist this. It turns out in America, 2 to 3% of architects in America are African-American men. 0.2% are African-American women. So, if in fact we design our spaces and then they shape us and we have this, they're not even at the table. And so he's trying to build an entire movement around this. And he's got a massive online effort to do a hip hop virtual camp with hip hop artists, famous hip hop artists that we may even hear from on Friday, as well as students, architectural planners, city planners, designers, to bring them together and actually listen to what people are saying and think about just architecture.
And this Beth and I were talking earlier in this conference we've been doing, this Humanities Design Summit. Today's session was on arts and science. And here's a really good example of how the arts, hip hop.
No, Peter, today was Mind and Meaning.
You're right. Today was Mind and Meaning. Tomorrow's arts and science. And the reason I'm
Beth,
so confused
we're doing this like in a few hours.
No, you did.
Yeah.
I just want to point this out that talk about every day being Blur's Day.
This is Blur's Day. Yeah.
Which we recorded yesterday because it's Singapore. And so we just finished today. Okay. I apologize.
We're not sleeping.
I apologize to all 24 time zones at once. But in any event, Ford is
tomorrow.
A great example. Ford is a great example.
And the arts.
Yeah.
Tink,
thank you.
Wait, what were you going with the science and the arts? Where were you going with that?
Oh, yeah. Well, look. Here's the whole point.
In Singapore, tomorrow morning in the U.S.
If we're trying to improve our cities and engage people in it, it is the use of this popular art form, in this case, hip hop, something that is completely understood by all the community that loves hip hop. But then what Ford does is he takes you through that particular art and understanding how hip hop letters and forms are created to then merge into understanding the science and this idea around architecture, right? So we're using art as a leverage into this. So there's this beautiful, and this is very similar to what we did at Gray Area when you think of that show, The End of You, that we talked about earlier, which looked at how is it that we can look at ourselves as in a systems across many dimensional scales, right? We are, we affect the biome, we affect the universe side of it. So anyway, there's this art-science connection in which we use art and that portion of ourselves to resolve and understand the science part of things. And in a time that we're headed in complexity, that's important. And so, we talk a lot about complexity and system science on this show. I think it is the arts and that form of thinking that opens and exposes that. So that's why I'm kind of thrilled. I'm also excited because I'm about to walk out the door and go to the Palace of Fine Arts to record the intro to tomorrow's segment of our conference about arts and science, to point out that there are moments in our history where we bring together a celebration of technology, a celebration of space, and exalting the human spirit.
Wait, when was the Palace of Fine Arts built?
It was built in 1915. It was exactly 105 years ago that such an event happened in the Panama Pacific Exposition, which, by the way,
this is right after the San Francisco earthquake.
It also celebrated the recovery from a disaster. So it brought together progress, the 20th century, the Panama Canal, opening up the Pacific ports, brought together that sense of science. And it brought together kind of the arts, that is, in fact, the Palace of Fine Arts. But they were using light in the 1915 exposition. It more than Burning Man. The sky was lit. The structures were lit. They were exalting the spirit. They were doing what Poppy talks about, because they were using physicality to encourage and enlighten us. So the arts and the sciences.
You're talking about Poppy Crum, the chief scientist for Dolby Labs, who's going to be joining tomorrow in Audacity, and she was on our show a few weeks ago. Okay, Ting, any last words?
Love your show. Thank you so much for having me.
We love you, Ting. Thank you for sharing. Just, you're doing the real work out there, and it's very inspiring.
Thank you. Have a good night.
And you know what that means? It's 5:41 Pacific Quarantine.
It is.
Nick will be back on Friday. We're gonna have to change.
Please, everybody tune in on Friday. I think we're gonna probably share a little extra from the Audacities conference, and just I think a special episode with Michael.
Take care, everybody. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Let's get close, but not so close. You can share from a distance, You know we want to see each other. You'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we talk.